Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lena Bartosson, and I work as the Secretary General for Folk och Försvar, or Society and Defense. And I would like to welcome you all to this seminar, which will highlight the challenges of dealing with corruption in the defense sector. Folk och Försvar is proud to organize this seminar together with Transparency International, FXM, the Swedish Defense and Security Export Agency, and SOF, the Swedish Security and Defense Industry Association. Defense corruption is a supply and demand problem involving both companies and governments. The point of departure for this seminar is analysis and anti-corruption indexes for companies and governments produced by Transparency International in the United Kingdom. Transparency International initiated its defense and security program in 2004 to help develop anti-corruption plans and training courses and to strengthen anti-bribery measures. And we are delighted to have Mark Pyman, who is the director of the defense and security program, with us here today. Mr. Pyman has led Transparency International's defense work from start. Mr. Pyman will be our first speaker today, and after his presentation, we will listen to representatives from two of the companies that are evaluated in the index, namely Saab and BAE Systems Hägglunds. This will be followed by a joint discussion. And this first part will be held in English. After a coffee break, we will switch into Swedish and have two panel discussions. In the first session, we will hear the view of FXM, the Swedish Defense and Security Export Agency, FMV, the Swedish Defense Material Administration, and SOF, the Swedish Security and Defense Industry Association. Then lastly, but not least, we will have reflections from two members of the Swedish Export Control Council. You are most welcome to participate actively in these discussions that we will have this afternoon. And just please remember that we stream this seminar live on our website, and that means that we need to use the microphone at all times. Once again, a warm welcome to you, and I now leave the floor to Mr. Mark Pyman.
Good afternoon, everybody. I usually walk around when I'm talking, so stop me if I have to be in front of this thing. I really like having the opportunity to speak at these sorts of events because often it's just industry, or it's just government, or it's just NGOs. It's not often that all three communities are in the same room. So I hope that means we have a good discussion, and I hope it means you're still talking to me at the end of the presentation. I've got about 20 slides. They're all available online in whichever way they're made online, so you don't need to take notes unless you particularly wish to. Now I press this one, I think. Okay, first of all, just can you see over there? Just a word or two on what our program does. We're about 15 people. Anti-corruption people, ex-military, ex-defense industry, ex-police, ex-diplomacy. So a mixed group of people, all focused on defense and security. And we cover these four areas, so armed forces and defense ministries, interior ministries and police, arms transfers and defense companies, and fragile states and peacekeeping. What they all have in common is the use of force, and what we have in common with them is that the corruption risks in such groups are often particularly high and particularly dangerous. We're working one way or another with about 30 countries. I was in Palestine this last week with the interior ministries and police, and the week before with Mexico. And my colleagues have just been in Ukraine and Yemen with the militaries. So a really wide range of countries. And the bit in the middle is what we do by way of common analysis tools. We do a lot of preventive training. At least we try not to do a lot of it. We try to train others to do the training, and various other tools that I won't have a chance to talk about. So let me first of all jump straight into this companies index that we did last year. We published it in October. It took about 12 months to do. And our objective was to try to find a quantitative way of looking at how good or bad defense companies were in their anti-corruption preparedness. So it's not about individual incidents or individual allegations. It's about the systems and processes that they have in place. And the 129 companies is more or less the whole worldwide cohort of big defense companies. It's from 32 countries, and amongst the 129 there were 4 Nordic companies. There's 34 questions, and Band A is the best and Band F is the worst. And we did the index twice. We first did it on the basis of what information is publicly available about the company. And we then invited all the companies to say, if you would like to, would you like also to give us all your internal information, policies, procedures, training plans, helplines, speeches from chief executives, so that we can reassess you based not only on what is public, but also on what you truly have in place that you have chosen not to make public. And finally, we give all the companies chances to comment. They see the first draft and they see the final draft, and they're welcome to comment and engage with us if they disagree with us. The set of questions for those of you who are involved in company and anti-corruption programs is not really controversial. These are the areas that we cover: leadership, governance and organization, training, risk assessment, personnel and helplines, policies and codes. And within each of those headings, there's a total of 34 questions. We drew up this set of questions together with a dozen or so people from the industry, so that they're roughly the right kind of questions to ask. What we did that was a bit different was, for every question, we have produced model answers. So you scored 2 out of 2 if you have this and this and this and this in place. 1 out of 2, this and this, 0 if you don't have them in place. And the huge advantage of that is it makes the results much more easily auditable. If you're a company, you can see what we have assessed you on and you can agree or disagree. If you're a public citizen, again, you can do the same. More important still, if you're a company trying to improve, so long as you agree with our assessment, then you can target the areas where you need to improve. So the results of that survey: there's only 1 company in Band A, there's only 9 in Band B, there's 15 odd in Band C, and everybody else is in D, E, and F. You don't want to be in D, E, or F. That is not a good place to be. So whilst we're quite cautious in how we state it, so I think D is you have a moderate level of anti-corruption capability, actually you don't want to be there, nor E nor F. So 70% are in D, E, and F. More unexpectedly, quite a large number of companies from Western nations were in D, E, and F. And we didn't really expect that. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. Finally, these are the results based on public information. So you can legitimately say, but do these companies have much more internal information that they have chosen not to reveal? And I'll say a word about that in a moment. Sticking with the public information for the moment, this shows you the results for the European companies, this lot here, and the US companies on the right. There's another block for the rest of the world, which I've just chosen not to show up here. What you see is the one company that's in A. It's an American company called Fluor Corporation. It's actually not really a defense company. It's a huge building contractor. But the 10% of their business that is in defense is so big, it puts them in the defense top 100. And actually therein lies a story, because one of the detailed analyses of these results is that pure defense companies score worse than companies in multiple sectors. So Fluor was the only one at the top. For example, the German company ThyssenKrupp, again, it's only 10% in defense. They scored rather well, despite the recent allegations, by being a multi-sector company. Again, that's rather unexpected, because if you work in the defense sector, there's a rather pervasive story that the defense sector is special and the precautions and the anti-corruption measures are especially good in the defense sector, but that's not what we found. Also, if you look at the bottom there, under both European companies and US companies, that's a lot of red, and we really didn't expect that. Moving on. I'm going to take you through 8 or 9 companies now, just to give you a sense of how the results turn out. So here's Saab, and I know Saab is speaking after me, so you can have the reasons why they're not all 100%. The top line of the results is the results based on public information only. And the bottom line is the results based on public information plus internal information. So if you look, for example, at leadership, they score 61%. That's good. You're looking for 100%. And they score a bit better if you look under the hood inside the company. The most distinctive ones are in risk assessment, where Saab has been very cautious about what it puts on the public website about what's its risk assessment process. But actually, when you look at it, it's actually rather a good mechanism and a good process. So they scored 100% on the internal information. The major weakness here is on training, where what they published was very little on how they do their training. And even when you looked underneath inside the company, what they had in place, particularly by way of training staff in sensitive and exposed positions, was not very strong. So they still only score 30%. Now that that gives you a feel for the kind of way we present the results, here's a Norwegian company. This is Kongsberg. Rather similar results, in a sense, to Saab, except that on the training side, actually they've got a really, what we think of as a rather good and rather thorough set of training machinery. Here's Nammo, which is the Norwegian ammunition company. Not doing so well. They chose not to provide internal information, and their external information on several of these headings was rather limited. And the laggard of this Scandinavian group is Patria from Finland, who were in the bottom category, scoring very little on anything. I have to tell you, in mitigation, we've had quite a few meetings with Patria since, who tell us that actually there's a lot that they are doing and that the next results will look substantially better than this. Changing countries, here's Boeing. And Boeing had a huge scandal about 6 years ago when they were caught bribing the Department of Defense to buy aircraft, to buy tanker refueling aircraft from Boeing for a $40 billion contract. Absolutely disgraceful. But since then, that was about 2005-06, they have been a very reformed character, which is why you see such a generally good set of results. I was in India a few months ago, having this same discussion with the Indian industry and the Indian government. Their equivalent of BAE or Boeing is Hindustan Aeronautics. And as you can see there, it's a sort of middle-ranking set of results. Just to show that India has some way to go, this is another of the big Indian defense companies scoring very badly. And there's something very interesting here, which is that this kind of set of results gives a really good tool for the Defense Industry Association to use as a basis for improvement of the sector. So in this case, there's Hindustan Aeronautics doing okay, Barrett Earth Movers doing really badly. That stimulates a lot of energy for the companies to say, well, what have I done wrong? What do I need to do different? And the Indian Defence Association is really picking up on this subject at the moment. Moving on, I promised to say a word about internal information. Of the 129 companies last time round, 34 of them chose to provide internal information. We were surprised it wasn't a higher number, because it seems pretty obvious you're going to do better if you provide internal information than if you don't. But it's the first time the index has been done, so I think a lot of companies were rather cautious about whether they wanted to provide all their internal information. I won't show you the results per company, but this is an interesting slide because it shows how did the internal results differ from the public results. And there are the 5 headings here: personnel, policies and codes, leadership and organization, training, risk management. And they're ordered by the extent to which the internal information made a difference. So in the case of personnel and helplines, the 34 companies scored A on the basis of public information only, and exactly the same on the basis of internal information. In other words, everything to do with personnel was already on the website. There was nothing extra to provide. Company policies and codes, they were a bit better on internal than on the public data. Same with leadership. But the bigger differences were at the bottom here, where companies saw a huge difference on training and on risk management, where in both cases this particular sample of companies were quite good and rather better than what they had put on their website. One of the good impacts of doing the analysis this way is that almost all the companies are currently busily putting what procedures they have out on their website so that it's visible to others what it is that they're doing. Moving on, if you look at the totality of this picture, the actions for companies are relatively straightforward to write up. The first is to be much more public about your ethics and anti-corruption programs. And the analysis just shows how many companies are remarkably silent about them. The second is one of the areas where the companies almost universally did badly was speaking up about intolerance of corruption. And most of the companies accepted that this was a fair criticism. Some of them were really good internally, but that's like 3 out of 129. Most of them just assumed that the fact that they were good citizens was enough, which I think is not how their staff perceive it. The third is a rather technical one, which is how does the board of directors review or decide whether the company's program is good or not? There's got lots of people doing things, but how do they actually decide, is our program good? And then you can read the other ones here that are further down the list of things they should do. Of the 34 questions, 7 of them were much better discriminators than others in identifying which were the better companies. And I've got a dozen or so copies of this report here for those of you who would like to take it. And it's those 7 questions. And what we have done in here, and indeed in the second volume, is we've given about 100 examples of what we think is good practice under each of these 7 headings. And these are tough questions. I mean, the question I've phrased as a 2-word question, but actually the way we ask the questions, most companies failed most of these questions. And this led us to something unexpected and really interesting, which is that we had this other index of government assessments, and I'll come to that in a moment. And while we go around the world talking to government defense procurement chiefs, they have said to us, well, we're quite interested in your government assessment, but actually we're much more interested in your company's assessment. I said, oh, why? And I said, well, because if you've got us right or wrong, well, then we may or may not do something about it to improve. But actually, we really want to see less corruption in our procurement. and your assessment of the companies is something that's really interesting to us. Because if you assess a company poorly, well, you might be right or wrong, but for the first time ever, it gives us a pointed question to ask the companies. And I've had this conversation with defense procurement chiefs in Saudi Arabia, India, Turkey, South Korea, UK, Norway, I mean a whole bunch of quite large arms buying countries. And they are really interested in how they can use this question and answer set to raise the average standard of everyone who's bidding to them. And that's the subject for us of a new initiative that we're starting on with those governments. I'm going to move on to a couple of other topics, moving away from the companies index now. The first is, defense is, I think, a really curious industry because it's one of the few industries that's really global. There's only about 30 big buyers, and there's only about 30 big sellers. I mean, I know there's thousands of defense companies, but they're all very vertically organized underneath the big platform makers. So actually that's quite an opportunity, which is if half of those governments decided to work harder to raise standards and half of the companies decided to play along, you could actually have quite a big change in the global standards across international arms buying and selling. And our picture, and this is an NGO's picture, is you can see it like this. The first is, we've done an analysis looking at the strengths and weaknesses of all the different defense governments, defense ministries and armed forces. Secondly, we've done the same thing for the companies that I've just been talking about. And I think what we might see next is, I think it is possible that we might find our way towards a global whistleblowing system where you're actually reporting per deal, not per country. I think it's realistic that some of those governments will apply these 7 questions to their major bidders. And as soon as 3 or 4 of those governments do that, imagine India, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, that's a sufficient proportion of the arms buying world that actually all of the industry will follow, because they couldn't not, because they're such big buyers. And finally, at the bottom here, some of you might know of the initiative in the oil industry and mining industry called the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, EITI. It's something that started 20-odd years ago now, when a couple of governments, one was Nigeria, and a couple of companies, BP and Shell, said, actually, we can do something directly to reduce corruption in this sector. So they set up a company, government, NGO initiative, which nowadays has about 60 governments in it and about 30 companies. I think it's entirely realistic that we can see the same thing in the defense sector. And I think in this case, it'll be governments, companies, and industry associations who could be playing a really active role. Let me just quickly cover a couple of other topics. This is the government index that I was mentioning a bit earlier. It looks rather similar. Looks like that. And this was 82 countries, and it was doing the same thing for countries that we've just done for companies. So it's saying, how good are your mechanisms to prevent corruption? A is the best, F is the worst. In this case, there were just 2 countries in A, Australia and Germany. And you can see from the list there where everybody else is. The initial reaction to this was annoyance from almost everybody. The Germans couldn't believe they were A. The Norwegians couldn't believe they were B. And everybody else thought they were higher. The only one who was happy was Australia. And I got a very nice email from the Inspector General of Defence saying, we're so pleased that TI recognises how good Australia's systems are. But after the initial reaction, actually the follow-up reaction has been really astonishing to us. Many of these countries have said, actually for the first time, we've got a metric that we can use to show how we can get better on corruption risk. So to give you an example that's true of both Norway at the top and Georgia some way down, what they did was they took all 77 questions, they kicked out the ones that were not particularly relevant to their country. That maybe knocked out 10 of the questions. They then knocked out all of the questions where they scored well. They thought, well, we don't need to do anything there, do we? Out they all go. They then looked to say, do we disagree with TI on any of these questions? And if we do disagree, does it change the ranking? Maybe that kicked out a few more. And then they said, of this question set that is left, we will now put an action against every single question, either for us, the government, or for civil society, or for the companies, whoever was the obvious action party. And I've now been in any number of governments having that discussion. Last week I was in Palestine, again, just going through question set by question, where they had scored badly and what they were going to do about it. So actually there's something very powerful here. There's also something powerful for arms exporting nations, which is that as part of doing this work, there's a 40-page report for every one of these countries. You need to go on the website and click the country, and it says, do you want to download the PDF? So we haven't had the money to make nice, pretty reports of each one. But that's very detailed. It says for every question, what source was used, why did the assessor come to the conclusion they did. It has the comments from the peer reviewers, who may or may not have disagreed with the assessor. So you can form your own opinion on whether you think our assessment is right or not. But also, if you are an arms exporting country, as Sweden is, it gives you a tremendous base of knowledge to say, what's our own assessment of the risk of this exporting to this country? Again, you've still got to decide whether you agree with us or not. But assuming we're not too far out, it's by far and away the most detailed bit of knowledge you'll find on any of these 82 countries. Just an example, this is because I was in India the other month. So here's the country equivalent of that company assessment I showed you a moment ago. So here's how India scored against its 5 headings. Here's a bunch of good things that the Indians have. Here's a bunch of bad things that the Indians have. And when we're in any one country, of course, the country is hypersensitive to these pluses and minuses, and you go through each of them in inordinate detail. A couple of final observations. This, again, is looking at the countries. And it's, if you're selling to a particular region, it allows you to say, for all the countries in that region, what do the different risk profiles look like against those 5 headings? This particular set is not a region, it's the biggest arms importers. And you see Australia doing rather well here, and Algeria doing rather badly. The Algerians are not happy, as you can imagine. But you can do the same thing by region, you can do the same thing by size of country, you can do the same thing by the countries to whom you principally export. I've mentioned a bit this idea of a possible global integrity initiative. Something significant is happening in the defense world and anti-corruption. And it's partly the climate changing, being rather more litigious, being much more expensive if you're caught bribing someone. It's partly that the customers are beginning to change their attitude. It's partly folk like us producing this information. But there's lots of interest now in forming collective associations. So this one in the middle here is called IFBEC. It's the International Forum for Business Ethical Conduct of Defense and Aerospace Companies. So it's the big global companies, basically. I think Saab is a member, yeah. But it's the single body that exists that can take a global view on this industry issue. And we're huge fans of it. It hasn't yet done anything particularly useful, but the fact that it's been created is really important. And we're actually very hopeful that it will become a force for global improvement on this subject. Similarly, you have national defence industry associations, as you have here. You have the European one. And for those of you who are involved, you also have the TI Corporate Supporters Forums, which is another forum for the same discussion. Let me stop there. Thank you very much.
I think we have 3 minutes or so for some questions. I would like to ask you first, because there is quite a gloomy picture that you present here when it comes to government awareness and also company awareness in some cases. What would you say is the biggest threat with corruption?
It depends immensely on the, well, let's just speak countries and companies. Within countries, it varies immensely. If it's a large importing country, the biggest threat is procurement. It's either waste of money or, more seriously, it's buying stuff you should not be buying for the sake of the commissions involved. If you're a poor country, it's not procurement because you don't have money to buy anything. It's much more that the defense ministry gets captured by elite interests who can extract money from the defense sector. It's very easy to do. In order to forward their own party political objectives. So, for example, in a number of countries, more than 50% of the defense budget is secret. It's very easy to steal from a secret budget. And you have examples, for example, this would be true of Kenya, where a whole string of defense deals were basically used to fund the party in power at the time, and were either unnecessary or didn't work. That's a very common problem. But you get very different problems in different environments. In West Africa, it's that organized crime has more or less completely infiltrated the defense ministry. So it's nothing to do with defense, it's to do with defending the illicit exploitation of national assets. So a much more serious problem. In other countries, the military intelligence agency has been taken over by organized crime. So again, its purpose is personal enrichment, not anything to do with national defense. In other countries, the number one problem is nepotism, so that all the incompetent people get to be the colonels and generals. Think Mali. So it's a very, very different picture from one country to another. With companies, I think it's reasonably straightforward that the environment where bribery was tolerated is going away at quite some speed at the moment, so that the penalties for reputational damage is high. The other thing is most companies these days really want to be seen as a values-based ethical employer, because it's quite hard to get good people. And actually, the youngsters of today are more sensitive than my generation as to the ethics of the company that they're joining. So that, for example, was one of the big factors behind BAE seeking to rejuvenate itself over the last 6 or 7 years.
Okay, is there any question now for Mark Pyman? Otherwise, he will be back for the discussion. But please, we have one there. You have the microphone.
Thank you. We often hear, if we don't sell, somebody else will. What would be your comment to such a statement?
Well, I mean, half a dozen different things. I mean, the first is that presumes that you're a kind of passive player in this this terrible world where bribery is ubiquitous. That's not true. I mean, it might particularly be true of individual countries, but it's increasingly untrue. Secondly, you will find some companies that are prepared to bribe left, right, and centre under all conditions. Yeah, they'll have some success. But I think you can be pretty sure they're not going to be big global international companies anymore. There are some exceptions to that, which we can talk about if we've got more time. Thirdly, and more importantly, most of the countries to whom you are seeking to sell, they in turn are seeking to upgrade the standards of their own defense industry. So, for example, I was in Turkey a few months ago talking to the Turkish Defense Industry Association, who are kind of, there's 3 of them in this index, and they're E, E, and F. And they really want to be better, because they want to be world-class exporters. And they know full well that if they just bribe everybody left, right, and center, they will not be world-class exporters. So, yes, you can take that view. I mean, I think it's an out-of-date view, and I think it shows, what's the right word? You wouldn't want to call yourself a values-based company if that was your argument.
Okay, thank you. We will be happy to see you back here in the panel discussion. And so for now, thank you very much, Mark Pyman. And I would now like to invite Petter Törnqvist, Legal Counsel, Head of Ethics and Compliance at Saab. Welcome.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much, first of all, to the organizers of this event. I really think it's valuable for us at Saab to come out here and describe part of the work that we are doing in this area. And I would also like to take the opportunity to commend TI and Mark on the work that you're doing in this area. We surely had our concerns when you first came out with the announcement that you were going to do the Defense Companies Index, and I still have some concerns about the way we were rated, of course. But I think that it's absolutely sure that we share the same objectives in this area. Now, when you read the papers certain days and you follow the reports in the media, sometimes you can get the impression that we in the industry doesn't really care about corruption risks. And to be blunt, nothing could be more wrong than that. And I will take the few minutes that I have here today to show you part of the resources that we are actually investing in this area. I will give you a very brief overview of our compliance program, but I will give you some more detailed information on how we assess corruption risks and what process we have put in place to appoint and manage our business partners and intermediaries. Now, this is really, I mean, we have 10 minutes here, so I will actually run through this presentation, but this is just to give an overview description of our compliance program. We obviously have a code of conduct, which is kind of the backbone of the entire program, setting out general principles on business ethical conduct, working environment, corporate social responsibilities, etc. This code is then supported by a number of area-specific policies with very detailed rules and requirements. We also provide a lot of training. We provide both web-based training, face-to-face training, and we have management sessions where we discuss these issues. We have also put in place a fairly structured way of monitoring this system, as I will show you on the next slide here. As you can see, we have taken the responsibility of the effectiveness of this compliance program all up to the board of directors and its audit committee. As you can also see, we have established also a ethics and compliance board on a group management level. It's headed by a general counsel, and it's also composed of our chief financial officer and our head of communication. Then we have an ethics and compliance function on an operational level. And on the left-hand side of the picture, you can see that we have a specific unit called M&M, Market Network Management. That function is devoted to handling the process that we put in place for intermediaries and business partners. Then, of course, as in most companies, we have a function of an internal audit that also carries some responsibilities in the area of monitoring our internal rules. Now, one of the areas where I want to give you some more detailed information is on how we assess corruption risks. It's quite a few years since we introduced a mandatory requirement all over the business that every single market or business initiative that we embark upon shall be preceded by a corruption risk analysis. Now, the idea is, of course, to, at an early stage, identify and handle all risks that comes with a specific market initiative, and then address them as early as possible. And to help the organization with this, because it's really easy to say that this is something that you should be doing, the tricky part is, of course, to tell them, how do you do it? And we've spent quite considerable resources in developing tools and checklists that the organization can use. Some of those are in paper format, but we're actually at the moment now working also on a web designed solution. These are, in essence, the key areas that you would be looking at. You would be looking at the market and the customer. The market is obvious. Defense carries more risk perhaps than if we are dealing with the civilian market, which we also do to a certain extent in Saab. We also look at the customer. When you're in a country, the corruption risk may be considerably higher if you're dealing with a particular authority or if you're dealing with a particular branch of the armed forces. Then we look into the country and the region. Doing that, we have a lot of help from TI's Corruption Perception Index. We also look at the Government Defense Index that was launched last year. Then, of course, we look at the nature, value, and complexity of the business itself. What is the procurement method that is being used? Are the evaluation criteria transparent? Is there a political decision required? Is offset part of the project? And how and when did we get to know of the project? All those are factors that we look into when we assess the business case as such. Another area is, of course, the business partner that we're working with and the key individuals behind that company. Is it someone that we have worked with before? Do we have a track record with this business partner? What are the connections that the key individuals have? Is it a listed company? Is it perhaps a very small consulting firm with only a few employees? And of course, we look at the scope of work. What are the actual services that are being provided by this business partner? Is it someone that will be acting in the interface with the customer? Or is it someone that has more of a back office position? Then another important area is, of course, the way that we pay or the form of remuneration. If you look back historically, commissions and incentivized schemes with success-based arrangements were quite common. Obviously, those arrangements carry a much higher risk than if you work with a fixed fee or with caps and retainers that are assessed in comparison to the actual workload. Then an important factor, and perhaps the most difficult to assess, is of course the perception between risk and the reward. Is there actually a balance between the efforts and the investments that the business partner have to come up with and the reward that is potentially there for them? Again, the purpose of this exercise is to identify the risks and handle them at an early stage. We shall always make sure that we take informed decisions at Saab. That's really what I want to underline. And if we can't get the facts right, or if it's still gray, then we should always walk away. Now, the other feature that I wanted to present to you now is this process that I've been mentioning a few times. This is not the classic Greek temple. It's rather a slide that serves to illustrate this process. The process itself is called appointment and management of intermediaries. Now, it's a process that we apply to every business partner that we are using the support of in the marketing phase. And we look at the form of the services being provided rather than the denomination of the partner. You can call him a service provider, you can call him a distributor, it could be a joint venture partner, it could be a marketing consultant, it doesn't matter. If he's assisting us in the marketing phase, then he will have to undergo this process. It's a central process. I've mentioned before that it's headed by a function called Market Network Management. It's currently composed of 10 people within Saab, and they are exclusively devoted to managing this process. So it's quite some resources being put down here. The first step is for the requesting business area or market area to come up with a business justification, describing in detail why they want to work with the business partner and the actual rationale for that. This business justification has to be signed by the head of the market or business area. So we're pushing the responsibility all the way to the top. And the signing authority cannot be delegated. So already at the initial stage, we have made sure that we have the top level focus on this appointment. Now, once the business justification is complete, M&M will then carry out a due diligence on the potential partner. That will include a questionnaire, it will include face-to-face meetings and outside screening. And M&M will also provide awareness training to the business partner, who will have to sign off that he has actually taken part of the training and understood what is being said to him. Now, if the due diligence comes out successful, M&M will proceed and negotiate and possibly also sign a written agreement with the business partner. The agreement itself is based on a template that has been produced by the Group Legal Affairs, and it includes common provisions on integrity. We have audit rights, there are reporting requirements, and as a general rule, those agreements cannot extend beyond a period of 2 years. That way we make sure that we have a regular assessment of the relationship. I should also mention that if certain thresholds are met, the actual agreement will be subject to the approval of the Ethics and Compliance Board. So I think this really shows how meticulously we are working in this area. And I hope that this very short presentation has given you a feeling for how seriously we take the issues. Now, if I may come back to Mark and the rating on Saab. You mentioned it. I think we scored 77.9% based on internal information, which then placed us just outside Band A, which was the highest rank. I still have some concerns about some of the grades that we were given. But if you ask us, do we strive to reach Band A? Well, put that question to my CEO or the board of directors, and the answer is obvious. Yes, we do. And I think that ever since the index was first launched, we have taken a number of initiatives to strengthen the system in some of the areas where we came out a bit lower. But if you ask myself, I'm not all that convinced that it's actually the best thing we can do. I think there are other things out there that would yield a better return. And then I think the first thing is probably, and I hope you would agree with me, Mark, is for the companies that are out there with less sophisticated systems in place or less attention being paid to these issues, to have them to actually catch up with the better companies. Now, the second area where there's a lot to do is, of course, in respect of governments and procuring authorities. That's also an area where we can see a lot of more work being done, and not least with the legislation. I really hope that there are other countries out there who are willing to take on this question as seriously as the industry and actually putting the adequate legislation in place and making sure that they enforce it. Because I have some doubts there. And that would then, in essence, be my concluding remark. I think there is currently being more done on the supply side than on the demand side. And I don't agree with you, Mark, when you say that IFPEC has so far not come up with anything useful. I'm in that steering committee, and the discussions we have had so far has been extremely fruitful.
Okay. Thank you very much, Petter Törnqvist. You will get an applause, of course. And you will soon participate in the panel discussion as well. But now first we will like to invite Robert Alvengren, who is the Legal Counsel Ethics Officer at BAE Systems Hägglunds. Welcome.
Thank you. Let's see if I can. Thanks. Thank you so much, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak about this important subject here today. Since BAE Systems Hägglunds is considerably smaller the company than Saab, I'd like to start with a brief introduction on who we actually are. We, BAE Systems Hägglunds AB, we design, manufactures, markets and supports military vehicle systems, such as the infantry fighting vehicle CV-90 and the all-terrain vehicle, the BVS-10. You can see those vehicles on this slide. We are based in Örnsköldsvik, and we are BAE Systems' largest site in Sweden with about 850 employees. And for those of you who are from overseas, you can grab me during the coffee break, and I'll be happy to explain this slide for you. If I was to describe our view on corruption, this would be a very, very short speech. BAE Systems has a zero tolerance tolerance approach to all forms of corruption, full stop. However, I would like to spend a few minutes on describing and talk about some aspects of our ongoing journey as a responsible business. BAE Systems ethics work really took off in 2008, which coincidentally was the year I joined the company. I wish I could take the credit for the accelerated focus on ethics. That would certainly help in salary discussions. But 2008 was the year when the independent Wolf Committee report was issued on BAE Systems ethical business conduct. And the report outlined 23 recommendations on how to improve our ethics work and become the leader in ethics, not just in the defense industry, but the industry as a whole. 2008 was also the year when our group code of conduct was issued, and that code of conduct is now applicable to all BAE Systems countries, businesses throughout the world. And we've come a long way since. A clear indication of our progress came with Transparency International when they ranked us in the top 10 of 129 companies in the latest index we've just heard about. One of the reasons why I think BAE Systems scored so high is that we have a broad and very comprehensive approach to anti-corruption. And these are just some of the things that we are doing. I just mentioned the extensive code of conduct. We do have mandatory ethics training. We have mandatory induction training for all new starters. We have an annual ethics training on our code of conduct for all employees. And that goes from top down, so the management committee is the first people who take the training, and then it's flown down through our managers to all employees. We've got policies on gifts and hospitality, conflicts of interest, facilitation payments, and so on. Just to give you an example, on the gifts and hospitality register policy, I cannot buy a government official a cup of coffee and a cinnamon bun without asking for prior permission from my colleagues in Washington, which is which can strike people as odd, given the fact that me, for example, I've got 2 legal degrees. I've worked as a judge, and I've been entrusted to sentence people to jail, but I cannot buy a cinnamon bun without asking for permission. But it goes to show how serious BAE Systems actually takes these issues. We have a local ethics officer at every larger site throughout BAE Systems. As you might have seen from the agenda, I'm the representative in Örnsköldsvik, and we get special in-depth training on ethics and anti-corruption. We have an ethics helpline since about a year ago, which is tailored to accommodate the special requirements under the Swedish Data Protection Act. And we are members of various international initiatives, as you can see from this slide. Now, strict gifts and hospitality policies and comprehensive codes of conduct will only take you so far in fighting and preventing corruption. Statistics from the United States show that 90% of Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is the anti-corruption legislation in the United States, the enforcement actions involve third-party intermediates. At BAE System, we have, as we've just heard with Saab, a set of procedures to make sure our commitment to ethical business does not end at our doorstep. If we choose to use local intermediaries, agents, or business partners when entering new markets. Before we even get to initiate a process to engage with third parties, intermediaries, what we call advisors within BAE Systems, we need a compelling business justification and executive level sign-offs. And when I say executive level sign-offs, I do not mean our management committee at BAE System Hägglunds. I mean from our parent company, in our case, located in the United States. So it's at a very early stage, just as Saab just described, we need to have executive involvement in these issues. And the justification I just mentioned is not just about making sure that the market where we want to do business is a safe market from an anti-corruption standpoint, but also that we actually need intermediaries in this market. There is a presumption that we should use our own expertise within BAE Systems in pursuing market opportunities. So there's we need a very strong business case in order to use advisors in the first place. If we do get the internal go-ahead to use advisors, we need to provide, that advisor need to provide in-depth information. As you can see from this slide, they, for instance, just to give you a few examples, they need to provide references from other businesses where they've with whom they've worked. They need to provide bank reference, CVs for their key personnel, corporate registration documents, financial information, and so on. We do have we engage with third parties, independent third parties, to do a thorough due diligence on this agent. And the findings are then summarized into a report which is submitted into BAE Systems. We have a specialized international compliance department in Washington who will conduct a due diligence interview with the potential agent. They do public record screenings, denied party screenings, media checks, and we do Google the advisor before we make any agreements with them. And the information we gather in this entire process is then collected and submitted to an advisor review panel, which consists of in-house lawyers, but also outside attorneys. And they review this and basically give advice on whether or not it's safe to go ahead and cooperate with this advisor. So once an advisor has been processed and approved, the thorough scrubbing that you saw basically continues. They need to sign template advisor agreements, take annual training. They need to undergo due diligence every 2 years, including discussions and so on. We make sure we appoint an agreement monitor in-house within, in my case, BAE System Hägglunds. And that agreement monitor, which is a special, which is an employee that has received special training on, for instance, red flags, is then the principal point of contact for the advisor. And make sure that the documentation that the advisor submit to us is in line with what we require. Payments is obviously monitored closely. We've got numerous levels of review to make sure that the payments are in line with what we would expect. And the legal department where I work, we review all payments, for instance. So I'd like to end this brief speech on anti-corruption with quoting our chairman, the group chairman, who said at this year's annual general meeting that today we believe we have some of the most stringent anti-corruption and compliance standards, not just of any defense industry, but across business as a whole. But we know there is always more we can do. And in fact, cultural transformation is a journey on which you never reach a final destination. So just to answer the questions I've just if there's more we can do on this, we certainly think so, but we think we've come a long way.
Thank you very much. And now I would like to invite the previous speakers here for a final panel discussion before the coffee break. So please. Petter Törnqvist, you mentioned that many other companies are very far ahead comparing to governments. I would like to ask Mark Pyman, can you agree on this?
I think the answer is about 25. I mean, remember, it's quite a concentrated industry. And I think, for me, the answer to the question is the ones who are in ABC of our index, I think, are the good ones, which is about 25 of them. And amongst them, I mean, there's a bunch of companies that really are good. If you do compare them to other sectors, like, the other sectors that would be good would be mining and oil. And these defense companies are absolutely as good as them. But that's not most companies. And I think one of the curious things about defense is the minute you drop down below the big platform makers, as they're called, of which Saab would be one, that the knowledge and understanding falls to zero almost instantaneously. So in terms of more to be done, there were lots of issues to do with how the big companies flow their anti-corruption mechanisms down to their suppliers and their contractors. And that's hard work. I mean, it's not an easy thing to do. So that, to me, would be why the answer is kind of a bit yes, but quite substantially no. I think there's one other issue here, which you might call the Enron factor. You know, you do get big companies who tick every box on the planet, but actually it's many years since they actually were good at this stuff. And that's just something that is always lurking away at the background, both on the part of the honest people in the companies and also on the part of folk like us. You know, if what we think is a company that's really good, do we really think so? Or is this a case of box ticking? And I think there are a few around today who would be a bit, at risk of that.
Okay, I would like to welcome any questions or comments from you here in the audience. So please just raise your hand and there will be a microphone coming. We have one question over there. Please introduce yourself as well.
I'm Michael Jenks from Ethics SRI Advisors. Mr. Pyman, do you notice a difference between private and state-owned companies when it comes to their compliance or processes in place?
I mean, the quick answer is state-owned companies are worse. But it's hard to do a like-for-like comparison because generally the state-owned companies are in countries where the average level of corruption is much higher. So the fact that they're no better and no worse than the country as a whole, if you like, shouldn't damn them straight out. You do get some companies where state-owned has not stopped them having a really energetic anti-corruption program. For example, there's a couple of Israeli companies, IMI and IAI, I think. Anyway, there's two of them that are state-owned. And they are absolutely as energetic as any of the private companies. The other slight oddity is the nature of defense is more or less everybody is a state company, not necessarily in an ownership sense, but in the sense that their only customers are state customers and they are usually there with the blessing of their state. So yes, I think the private element tends to make for better behavior, but I don't think there's anything inevitable about it.
Thank you. And we have one question here on the third row, please.
Is it on? Yeah. My name is Susanne Oxenstierna. I work at FOI, the Swedish Defense Research Agency, and I work a lot with the Russian defense sector. And my question to the panel is that isn't there a problem with some of these countries that to be transparent is against the law? I mean, if you take Russia or Kazakhstan or so on, I mean, very large parts of the Russian defense budget is under secrecy, and also the whole procurement, armament procurement is under the law of state secrets. And also, if you say that it's very bad to be in this F section, but I can imagine companies that think that it's quite good, not only for legal reasons, but also for making it more difficult for people who want to do illegal things to, if you know the system, if you know the anti-corruption system, I mean, it's easier to go around it. Thank you.
Thank you. Who wants to start on this?
Well, I can take the first part of the question, at least. I think one of the blessings of working in an area like this for a Swedish company is that we have to have the support and the consent of the Swedish export authorities, ESP, before doing export deal. And that essentially means that many of those countries where we would have real concerns about at all doing business are off the agenda or the radar. Russia and the former Soviet republics are not countries that we would typically ever consider going into.
Mm.
If I can give a different angle on that. I think in the case of Russian defense companies, they will be in the category of companies who almost universally score badly here, who do not have a good reputation, and where I think for the moment there's little sign of changed behavior. On the other hand, the big people they're selling to, India, for example, is one of their biggest buyers. And for all that India still has various corruption scandals, they are putting all sorts of measures in place to sort of weed out some of these issues. So they just put a new defense procurement law in place about 9 months ago. And I would be surprised if that didn't have an effect on Russian companies. But to give you I think the other interesting thing here is that things change over time. And let me give you the example of Chinese companies, which you could easily put in the same bracket as Russian companies. If you look at the Chinese equivalent of Boeing, which is a company called COMAC, Commercial Manufacturing Company of China, actually their systems and procedures are actually remarkably good. And the reason they're remarkably good is because China really wants to be accepted as an international seller of major aviation. And it has formed a view that actually they need to be good on the anti-corruption front in order to be able to do so. So what you're seeing there is, if you like, the first signs of a movement in a country where previously you would have expected none at all. We have none of that for the moment from Russia. We have a very active TI organization in Russia. And despite the defense minister changing last year for someone who's much more reform-minded, I don't see any sign of change in this area. So I'm kind of half agreeing with you and giving you the example of China to show that things can change.
But do you think that there are companies that are very happy being in the category F and will stay there?
No, I don't think so, actually. I mean, I think we've had quite a lot of correspondence with companies that are in category F, and I certainly haven't yet met one that's happy about it. No, I don't think so, because you very quickly get involved in national pride issues. So, for example, we work quite a lot with South Korea, with the South Korean Defense Procurement Agency and the South Korean Defense Ministry. There's 3 South Korean companies in that index. I think it's E, E, and F, if I remember rightly. They're there for a very good reason, which is there's lots of corruption going on in that particular part of the Korean defense world. The companies are not happy about it, and the government most certainly isn't happy about it, because it's a way of publicizing the status quo. And there's no doubt they don't like it. So I've just had the Korean Defense Procurement Agency over in Force to London about a month ago with what they're planning to do about it. So no, I don't think. I mean, there will be the odd company, but I don't think so.
Okay.
Sorry,
Yes.
if I may pick up on that, Mark, because I think that is another reason why we would like to see more activities from the procurement side. Again, I don't think anyone wants to be in those lower bands, but for sure, those that are not there but in the higher ranks would actually like to see that as a discriminating factor in procurements. And we don't see that, quite frankly, so far. I mean, the importance that is formally being attached to the compliance works of companies so far is not at the level that we would like to see.
And I mean, I completely agree with that. And it's one of the things that we do with the defense governments, which is to seek to push them to put higher standards in procurement. Right now, the principal obstacle to doing that is, for the EU, it's the EU regulations. We are unable to put any such requirements in, despite trying to find all sorts of ways of doing so. And the same is true in several of the other jurisdictions, like India and like South Korea. You're literally not allowed by law to say anything about integrity standards as a condition for purchasing. No, I think we'll still find a way around. But actually, it's not an easy one to solve.
Okay, we will have soon to finish for a coffee break, but let us have just 2 very short questions. Please, you start, and then Göran Lennmarker on the front row.
Yes, indeed, very short. First, my name is Per Agrell from the company of Secana. No more about that. Thank you for very nice presentations first. But I also miss the word of lobbyism. I think there is a fuzzy borderline between lobbyism and corruption, and lobbyism could be quite as dangerous for efficiency, democracy, etc. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then Göran Lennmarker.
Okay, thank you. Just a short question. When you rank countries, how important is the role of controlling or overseeing defense companies versus the role of the state as a buyer? Are they equal, or what is the weight of that?
Thank you. Mark Pyman, would you like to start, and then we continue to Robert and Petter?
On lobbyism, I can only agree with you. I mean, it's a big issue. It's one, I mean, there's a couple of questions in the index on it, but it doesn't sway the results very largely one way or the other because it's only a couple of questions. It's a really big issue, I mean, especially in the States, but also elsewhere.
In Brussels.
Oh, I can't imagine that, not the EU. It's a big issue, but this doesn't really pick up on it in a direct way. The second on the government index, actually it's all about the defense ministry and the armed forces. So only about 30% of the questions are on procurement. In other words, its role as a buyer. Its role of overseeing defense companies as a seller is only 1 or 2 questions. So it's not at all about the role of government as a seller, but it covers more than just procurement. So it covers organized crime in the military, it covers illegal sale of assets, it covers nepotism in promotions, lots of things broader, but it's not about the exporting side of the countries.
Okay, thank you. And Robert?
Yeah, just a short comment on the question regarding lobbyism. I think we need to be we need to admit that we've been quite immature in Sweden when it comes to lobbyism. That I'm speaking just from our own experience, that we've had inadequate policies in place, at least in my business, when it comes to lobbyism, and it's been a journey, and we've had a lot of help from our US parent company, where, as you just said, lobbyism is a much is a greater question, and it has been debated a lot more than I think is the case in Sweden. So I think it's something that we need to admit in Sweden, that we still are very much immature in that area.
Okay, and Petter?
Yeah,
please.
well, to a certain extent, I would agree. I mean, the simple answer when it comes to lobbying is that we treat that very much as any other marketing activity in Saab, but of course, when you talk to your US peers, they have a completely different view on it. But I think that is also partly because of the difference in the political systems. Of course, I mean they have worked much more on that on a detail level for ages, which we simply haven't in Sweden. Now, I wanted to pick up on this comparison between the ranking companies and ranking governments, and I think what we can see from the industry side, I mean, of course, if you get a good rank in the company index, that is hopefully something you can use and benefit on in your business. But what we've also seen is that we can have some value of the work that you've been doing on the government defense index, where we can actually see, although we have a lot of intelligence on our own, it's always good to have a third party looking into it, and you can see that there are actually quite big differences if you take that index and put it next to the corruption perception index, which you know gives a certain picture on a country, and then if you look at the corruption risk that TI has assessed to the actual procurement authorities, that might differ quite dramatically from the corruption perception index. So it's good information for us in the industry as well.
Thank you so much for a very interesting discussion. We will now take a coffee break, and I would like to say that you will have to choose a paperback book from here in the back, and we will continue in 20 minutes time. So welcome back, and please give our gentlemen an applause as well.
Thank you, Mark.
See you again.
Yeah. Are you heading off, because the next part, I guess, is